This is part 11 of our tomato grow along, and today we're mainly going to be looking at how to preserve them. First of all, we're going to look at how to freeze them, and then we're also going to look at how to can them. Before we do talk about canning and freezing the tomatoes, I just quickly want to address when these tomatoes are going to be needing to be harvested and when it's too late in the season to continue ripening them. Many people seem to be spreading information about how it's too late now for our tomatoes to continue harvesting and it's time just to take all of them in green and try and ripen them inside the house. And for some people, maybe that's true, but for the majority of us, I don't believe that is. So, first of all, if you are growing outside and your temperatures are consistently down to 5 Celsius, then the chances of them ripening may be reduced, but that is going to depend on what the weather does on the next few weeks and months and when your first frost date is. If you are not expecting your first frost date, like myself, for another 2 months, even though we have had that blip in temperatures, then the chances are they still have a considerable amount of time to ripen. This is obviously going to be more difficult for those that are ripening outside than those that are ripening in a polytunnel. If I now myself had a low temperature consistently of 5 Celsius, I would be working out when my last frost date is and whether there's any chance of that improving. If there isn't, then I would be taking these in as green tomatoes and probably calling it a day. But if my last frost date was a long way off and therefore every opportunity is still to ripen them slowly, then I would be leaving them on the plant for a little bit longer. We do want to make sure that we have taken off as much of the foliage as we can, so head back to video 10 and look at that, and also remove any of the newer blossoms that are not now going to mature to tomatoes. For those of us growing in a greenhouse or a polytunnel, this is going to be extended even further. So my usual frost date, like I said, is around mid-November, but I've had these in the polytunnel in late November and still doing absolutely fine. So a small frost that's going to attack outside wouldn't necessarily attack the plants inside. If there was a frost that I was worried about, then I would be harvesting the fruits that were as ready as possible and maybe putting on the heater for a couple of nights. But if it was a consistent frost, then I would at that point be taking those green tomatoes. If your polytunnel is in a sheltered position, even if your frost dates are a little bit earlier, there's even a chance that you can keep these plants in here till December. So don't just assume that because your frost dates are happening that there's going to be a definite yes or no answer to this. Get yourself a thermometer and see what's actually happening in your undercover space of whether or not it is likely that you are going to need to remove these. Of course, if you do have plants that are going to be coming into the polytunnel to grow over winter, then it may be that you are ready to take these plants out sooner anyway, in which case they can be picked as the green tomatoes and then popped inside in some baskets with a banana, although they work perfectly fine in my opinion without a banana, as long as a couple of them are already starting to ripen, and they will ripen over the next days and weeks for you. The remainder of these tomatoes now that I'm not using have just been washed, and I'm going to core them, and then they're going to go in the freezer ready for the next recipe that we'll be using them for. And at this point it is a good idea to cut out any bad parts as well, especially when we're freezing them, because we're not going to be able to remove them quite as easily once they are defrosted. For any that are really large, I'm just going to cut them in half so they fit in better. If you haven't already saved some seeds from yours, then do check out the video of how to save the seeds and which the tomatoes are suitable to save from. These will stay in the freezer perfectly fine now for at least 6 months, but you could leave them in there up to a year. Removing as much as the air as we can and then tying them up. And then for our cherry or salad tomato varieties, we just want to remove the stalk off the top and pop them straight into a bag. These, of course, are not going to have the same texture as they would if you were to just defrost them. So you are still going to want to pop them into recipes, and they are great just to pop into some spag bowl or something, or to roast along with some other things to keep it nice and sweet. And they stay nice and individual, so you can pull out exactly what you want when you're ready as well. There are 3 different types of canners available on the market. The first one being a pressure canner. That isn't what we need today because tomatoes don't have an acidity level that requires that. So we can use today a steam canner, which is what I'm going to use, or we could use a water bath canner. So this is just the largest pot that I have that we're going to use to represent a water bath canner today. Usually they would be larger than these ones. To use a large pot as a canner, we would need a trivet that will go in the bottom and fit. This one's obviously too large for this pan. Or you would require a tea towel that you can pop in so the jars are not going to move about in there. The other thing that we're going to need to make sure that we've got is jars that are small enough to go in the canner. So these ones would fit in here and have an inch of water above the jar itself. So I could probably fit maybe 5 of these in this particular large pot, and they would be absolutely fine to use like that. If we were, however, using larger jars, we would need a much larger water bath canner than this. And then the one that we're going to use today is the steam canner. So this comes with a dial on the top. You will need to set it up before your first use to work out where the pressure is correct within your area. So that's what that little black mark is that you might faintly see there. It has an area at the back to allow the steam out. And then inside we have a trivet. And then for this particular type of canner, the water just goes up to the trivet level and not any higher. And then this type will take different types of jars as long as it has the room for the lid to still go on, and the timing to actually can in it isn't too long because it will run out of water if it is too long. This is the one that we use because this, in my opinion, is much safer for me. I cannot manage taking the jars in and out of a water bath canner safely. So this one is much easier in the fact that the jars are always above the water level and never below. If you were canning with lots of smaller jars that are this height, then you can also add a second layer, and that's the same with any of the canners that we're using. Other things that we are also going to use today, and these are not very expensive to pick up, so they are worth getting in my opinion, and these work with the Kilner or the Ball jars available in the UK. First of all is one of these magnets, because these are going to go into warm water before we use them. It just makes it easier to pop them on and off. And then this tool gives us both measurements in order to make sure that we have the right head space within the jars, which is how far the fluids that we put in the jars go up. And then we also use it as a debubbler within the jar. Then we have these little tools, which are a jar lifter, and that's just going to enable us to lift it while it's hot in and out of any of the canners. And then we have these little funnels which go on the top of the jars and just save us from getting the rims too dirty. Out of all of these, the things that I would make sure that I definitely have would be a jar lifter. The only time which maybe that wouldn't be appropriate is if you are just using these WEC jars, because they don't really safely pick them up. You can buy one especially for the WEC jars, but I find that without using a water bath canner and just using a steam canner, that I'm absolutely fine just using the jars and a tea towel. And then we have the different size jars that are available in the UK. So this is the larger jar, which would be a quart, a half quart, and a quarter quart. So this one's around 1,000 millilitres. This is 500 millilitres, and this one's 250 millilitres. The size jars that we use usually depend on the recipe that we are using, but usually when we're water bathing, we're using one of these two sizes. These are regular mouth jars, and then we have our flats that go on the top. This is an old one. Some people reuse them, some people don't. It is advised not to reuse them. And then we have the rings. The jars need the rings in order to go in the canner, but as soon as they are canned and this button no longer presses down, we have a seal, then that ring is going to come off when these jars go into an area to be stored until we use them. As well as these regular mouth jars, you can also find wide mouth jars, which are good for foods that are going to get stuck, or if you're pickling and things like that. So they are straight up rather than have a neck. So you want to make sure that you've got the right size rings and discs for your jars. Then we have jars that are just ones that we reuse. I prefer them to have a butter on, so I think this is like a marmalade jar or something like that. If they have a button, then they usually already have been heat treated, so you'll know that the glass is strong enough to go back through that process. And then this is a variety called Weck jars, and these are my absolute favourites. They have a beautiful thickness to the glass. They also don't have any plastic, which these ones do on the underside. They are sprayed, and they, in my opinion, are often ones that don't seal very well. And then all we do with these is we have a rubber seal, and these are really cheap to replace. So although the jars are a little bit more expensive initially to buy, they are, in my opinion, cheaper to continue using. So they simply just sit, make sure that rubber's on correctly. So the rubber simply sits over the lid, and then you have a couple of clips that go on. When they've gone through the process and the food has sealed, this little tab sits down, and that gives us an indication that they have sealed correctly. And then they are stored with the clips off, which gives us absolutely no chance of having a false seal as well. And then you can also buy these lids that will go on the top. So after you've opened the jar, if you're doing jams or something, you're not using it all in one go, then you can just pop a lid on and they'll sit in the fridge like that. We also are going to use some citric acid or lemon juice today, and it would be bottled lemon juice, not fresh lemon juice. Unless the recipe states that it's fresh, then we tend to stick with bottled. And this is the variety of canning lids that I use to replace the Kilner ones, a company called For Jars. And I do reuse them if they're in good condition, but these seem to have a better quality and don't get as scratched and rusty as the Kilner ones seem to. So if you are looking for replacement lids, then they are the ones that I tend to use. The Weck jars come in 101 different sizes, right to very, very tiny ones that are wide, or tiny ones that are quite narrow, to really, really big, tall ones that you'd keep like your pasta and things like that in. I tend to use ones that have a similar size to the Kilner jars, just so when I'm using the recipe, it's easy to work out the amount of additives that I need if there is anything like sugar or the citric acid that's going in the jar rather than in the recipe. And it also then allows us to know how much time to process them for if they're a similar size. So this jar is actually the closest size to this one as I could find. The only thing I would say about the Weck jars is they don't always fit as neatly and snugly into the canners, although I have some that are very tall and very thin, and you could fit loads more of those in, so it really depends what you're using them for. There is a book as well for recipes and ways to use the Weck jars if you want to check that one out as well. I tend to buy them online and then get a bulk amount. The postage is quite expensive, but they worked out when I bought the last lot at the same price as the Kilner jars. And then, as I said before, the seals are cheaper to reuse. So the rubbers, when I bought them last time, were around 5p each, whereas the canning lids for the Kilner jars were nearer 50p each, depending what type or what brand you buy. I've given all my jars a wash because they've been stored outside and now they're going to go in the dishwasher. If you put it on a quicker cycle, this is going to allow them to be sterile and to be warm, because if we are using warm food, we always have to have warm jars to put the food into, or we risk the jars breaking. So I always do this in the dishwasher. You can also do it in the canner, so you wash them up, put them in the canner for 10 to 15 minutes, then drain the water out and start filling with the food then. This is the selection of tomatoes that I've got to deal with today. And so we've got 2 baskets that are completely ripe. These ones are a mixture of mainly not ripe ones yet, so they're just going to go in the baskets after these ones have come out. And then these ones are ones I took out the freezer last night. And one of the great things about doing it this way is all that liquid that was in those tomatoes has come out, so we now don't have to cook them down as long. So we're going to go over the different ways of removing the skin on these tomatoes in a minute, but this one is definitely my favourite way. So we're going to make tomato sauce today, which is literally just going to be these tomatoes cooked down and blitzed up. If you have a food mill, then you don't need to remove these skins beforehand. If you don't have a food mill, then we're going to remove the skins, and we're going to look at 3 different ways of doing that today. First of all, looking at these, which are the defrosted tomatoes. So the first thing I'm going to do is just remove this liquid that's gathered at the bottom as they've defrosted. And then now we've got the majority of that liquid out, we can just start peeling these tomatoes. So still slightly frozen. You can also save these skins to be dehydrated and made into a tomato powder to be added to recipes. They slip off really quite easily, so it's a much easier process from my point of view. And then next we're going to start looking at the fresh tomatoes. So these are the ones that were in the baskets that are really quite ripe now, and they're really nice and soft, so they should be nice and juicy. And we're going to roast these ones in order to remove the skin, and then we're also going to go over how to boil them to remove the skin. So all we need to do now is cut off the tops and just check them over to make sure there's no damage on the tomatoes that also needs cutting off. All the varieties that I'm using today are suitable for canning, so they are sauce or paste tomatoes. If, however, you are using eating tomatoes for this, then you're just going to cook that down for longer until those tomatoes get thicker, because these are really fleshy and they're being bred in order to make sure that they've got lots of meat and not much water. So if you've got ones with more water, then it's going to be a matter of cooking that down to remove that water, otherwise you'll have a very, very thin tomato sauce. This one here you can see is not looking very healthy at all, so I'm just going to use the bottom half of this one. And then all I'm doing now is just cutting each of these tomatoes in half. I'm going to lay them flat on the baking tray. These are going to be mixed in with my other tomatoes, so I'm not going to add anything to them, but you could add some roasted onions and some roasted garlic and some herbs and things, and then blitz them up with those added to them, and either freeze them or can them. It is better to follow a recipe when you are canning, just to make sure the acidity levels are correct. These are going to go in the oven now at about 220 for 30 to 40 minutes until those skins are ready just to slide off. They are of course going to be hot now, so you're going to want to make sure that you don't use your fingers to remove the skin or let them cool down first. And then the other thing we've got is some water that has already started coming out of these tomatoes as well. So we're just going to go ahead and remove some of these skins. Now we just want to scoop these tomatoes into the pan, leaving as much water as we can behind in the roasting tray. For our next option, we're going to need a pan of boiling water and then a big bowl for an iced bath as well. So I'm going to core these exactly the same as we did before, and then on varieties like this that are quite bumpy, I'm just going to put a cross in the bottom to help that skin come off in a moment. And then varieties like this, I'm just going to pop that cross in the bottom. Now we're just going to carefully pop these tomatoes into the boiling water, and then they should within seconds be showing that their skin is starting to divide from them, and then we're going to pop them into the icy water. So that was literally a couple of seconds, and you can already start seeing that the skin is peeling off. A couple more seconds and then lift them out, and there we go. You can see it's already started, so then they're just going to go into the ice bath to stop that cooking process and help that skin come off. And then now we can just slide these skins off really easily, and this method is probably the best method if you're wanting chopped tomatoes, not to mix them up in a moment and blend them. And what we have now is another collection of water in the bottom, so we're just going to remove as much of that as we can now before we pop it on the heat. We've brought it to the boil, and now it's been cooking down for about sort of 10-15 minutes. And the next thing I'm going to do is use the immersion blender just to break these up. If you don't want any seeds in your mix, then I would use a masher, break those tomatoes up, and then once they are broken up, pass it through a sieve. When adding salt, you want to make sure that it's kosher salt or that it's got no anti-caking agents in it, because that isn't great then to can with. We're just going to let this sauce reduce a little bit now before popping it into the jars. The sauce has reduced down nicely now and is ready to be canned. And then I've taken the jars out of the dishwasher, so these are warm, so I need to fill them now as quick as I can. Then we've got our little funnel to make sure that we don't get them dirty. Here I've also got some white vinegar, which we're going to use to clean the rims. You also can put a little bit of this into your canner, and it will make sure the jars come out a bit cleaner. First thing I'm going to do though is pop the citric acid into each of the jars, so I don't forget to do that. And then we've got our lids and our seals in some warm water ready for when we're going to pop them on the jars. You want to make sure that your canner is on at this point and nice and hot, ready for these hot jars to go into. The headspace that we're looking for today on this one is 1/2 inch. With our wet jars, you do add another 1/4 on top because of the way that the lid sits inside. Next thing we're going to do is debubble. So some of these I will still be putting some more into in a moment, and some I'll be taking out because they're really too full. But if we debubble them first, it's going to allow us to know which ones had a bit of air in and actually which ones might go down a little. Usually with the thinner liquids like this, we're not going to find that they do really go down at all. If you had something really thick like apple sauce, then they go down considerably. So you're just going to run your debubbler down the edge and just remove any bubbles that you can. And then next we want to see how much we've got in each of these and how much we want to take out. So just pop your measurement in and take out until you're at the right height, or indeed add some more in. Next thing we're going to do is clean the rim of each jar. If any of the jars have got any damage to them, then it's definitely not worth putting them through the canner. Just use them for some dry stuff instead, because what you'll find is that the heat may end up breaking them. Just going to double wipe these because some of them are quite grubby. If you don't have any white vinegar, then just a piece of kitchen paper with some water on will be absolutely fine as well. Now we're going to take our little magnet and grab us some lids and just pop them on the top. So one of the things that we need to do now is make sure that these are finger tight, and what that means is that there is still room for the lid to slightly allow the steam out. So if we did these too tight, what we're going to end up doing is have the lid buckle. So you're just literally going to tighten them ever so slightly so they very easily come off. And then for the wet jars, we're just going to lay the rubber out and pop them over and add the clips. So as we are only water bathing these, this is going to require 2 clips per jar, not 3 that you would do if you were pressure canning them. And then for our jar that we're reusing, we're just going to do exactly the same, where we're just finger tight, so don't over tighten those either. You can reuse the wet seals as long as there is no obvious stretching that's happened with them or any cracking within the rubber itself. So these are the hot jars going into the hot canner. It's very important that the temperatures are the same. So we've got these 4 jars going into this hot canner, and then we're going to pop the lid on, and we're going to keep an eye on this now for that red bar coming over to the black mark that I've previously made. Once that black mark and the red one are together, that's when we start the timer. If you're using a water bath canner, then it will be as soon as your canner is at a rolling boil. So my canner has just come up to temperature, so I'm starting the timer now. The timer for the 500 millilitres or half quart jars is 35 minutes, or 40 minutes for the larger quart or 1000 millilitre jars. Make sure to keep a consistent watch over the canner to make sure that that level doesn't drop, or that if you're using a water bath canner that the rolling boil doesn't stop. If it does, then you do need to restart that process. I'm doing this on a glass hob today with this steam canner, but the water bath canner and the pressure canner that I've used are not okay on this glass hob. It doesn't go hot enough, so they take too long to come back to temperature. So I use a camping stove and some gas rather than this. It could also cause issues with possibly breaking them, apparently. Not that I've ever had that happen myself. I've got these 2 jars remaining that didn't fit into the canner, so if I leave these to go completely cold now, I can process them tomorrow in a cold canner. So whenever you have cold jars, the jars that you put the food into, if the food is cold, the jar has to be cold. If the jar is cold, the canner has to be cold. Otherwise, you risk some shock. If the ones that are in the canner don't actually seal, then you have 24 hours to reprocess them in order to try and get them to reseal. If you don't want to do that, then one thing you can do is keep them in the fridge and use them within a few days. The alarm's just gone off, so rather than whipping the lid straight off, we're just going to turn it off now and just very gently lift this lid slightly to allow some of that steam to be released. This is going to help us not have any issues with siphoning. And then we're going to come back in another 5 to 10 minutes and remove those jars. We're going to move these jars now onto some kitchen towel. This is once again to stop the shock of the heat hitting the cold counter. So we're making sure that there's less thermal shock. And then for the wet jars, I just grab a hand towel and move them like that. In the next few minutes, you'll likely hear some popping happening, and this will be the lids pulling in their little buttons. So that one and that one's already happened. I think this one maybe slightly Can't really tell whether it has or not, but I'm not going to press it. What we don't want to do is get a false seal right now. And then with our wet jars, it's whether or not this is pointing downwards. We're now going to pop a towel over the top of these so the temperature reduces on them much slower than it would if we were to leave them exposed. If you are going to can the next jar straight away, make sure that you still have the sufficient amount of water in your canner. So I need to come back up to the trivet now on this one to continue processing those, or allow it to go cold and then do them tomorrow. So we are now 24 hours later and we're having a look at whether or not these have sealed. So first of all, this one, the button is down, so that's definitely sealed. This one, once again, the button is down and that's sealed. This one, however, you can hear a difference. So the button is not sealed on the jar. I did notice it last night, so it's been in the fridge overnight. So this one definitely hasn't sealed. Then I need to take clips off of these ones to see if these have sealed properly. So first of all, this jar that we know isn't sealed, I'm going to unscrew this one. And you can find if the screws are not perfectly round, it can rip off the lid as well. So that one definitely hasn't sealed. You could now reprocess that within 24 hours if you wanted to. I'm just going to use it for tea. It could be that there's an issue with the seal here. It's not quite got the rubber all the way round, but it could just as well be that I've done something that's caused that. And then we have this one, and these will be loose when they come out the canner. That's completely normal. So gently opening that one up. And if it's sealed correctly, you will be able to lift it up just by holding it by the disc on the top. So this one has sealed perfectly. That one's great. And then we've got these wet jars. So I'm wondering whether this one has, because it's a little bit of the rubber is poking out the side here. So once again, pick it up by the edge, and yeah, that one's good. I'm going to do the same with this one. So that one's fine. And the last jar is this one. So once again, that's absolutely fine. Make sure that you give your jars a good wash before they get labelled and then go onto the shelves. This is just going to stop any food being around the rims of the jar, which can cause issues with mould. We want to make sure that we store these jars with the rings off or the clips off for the wet jars. This is going to stop us having a false seal. And these will now store at room temperature on a shelf for at least a year, but they should be good for 2 years. If when you open them there is any mould, any spoilage, any odour that's incorrect, anything that you're questioning, then you dispose of it. If they look and smell exactly as they did when they went in the jar, then they're safe to eat. Now what we've got left is the skins off of the tomatoes that we've just squeezed out as much of the excess water as we can, and then we can dehydrate these. So I'm going to pop these into my dehydrator and then I'll blitz them with a coffee grinder to make a powder. If you don't have a dehydrator, you could also do this with the oven by just having the light of the oven on and then popping them on some parchment paper on a oven tray and leaving them like that for probably at least 12 hours, and they want to be really obviously dry before you do put them into a powder. It's a great way of using up the skins and having some extra flavour and making it more of a zero waste product than it would be otherwise. If you don't want to do this, then they can obviously just go straight onto your compost.